Misc, A Tiny Tale. This is a 3D platformer for the Switch and PC that has very strong Chibi-Robo vibes. Aesthetically, I think if you ever seen what a Chibi-Robo is, this character looks like that. And narratively, it also has a lot of similarities, but I think it does a really good job of distinguishing itself, partly due to the gameplay, because mechanically, it plays a bit more like a 3D Mario, maybe like a Banjo-Kazooie, if you're more familiar with that, right? But I think it smartly uses that kind of different approach in game design to kind of augment the Chibi-Robo aspect of this game that gives the game its own feel and personality. I will say up front, I got a code for free on this one. It's pretty rare for me, so, do what you will with that info. Also, I plan to do a podcast with one of the developers on the game, so again, do what you will with that info. Just a heads up, because it's a very rare thing for me to do on this channel. So, a little tiny robot in a big world kind of thing. And the environments themselves aren't really super platform heavy in the sense that they're more of just 3D kind of sandbox worlds, right? There's 8 of them total, I believe. And these are mostly open environments with, maybe say 4 kind of core quadrants to each area. As you go around those areas, you usually, pick up the kind of core objective of this game is to get golden gears, which basically open up the gate to the next area. Some of these are just floating around the world themselves. Other ones, you do little fetch quests and things like that for characters in the world to get. And then kind of the secondary collectible is trash around the world. So, similar to Chibi-Robo, where you go around the world, pick up trash, scrub up oil and things like that. You do that in this game as well, and you get special points in addition. But the points here play more of a role in unlocking additional narrative that kind of flesh out your character's role in the world and how those characters are kind of impacting the other characters around them. I think the narrative is really the strongest point of Misc, where each world has kind of their own different set of characters, and each of them have kind of their own individual problem, which, sounds pretty standard, I guess. But I think the big core difference here is really how it's written, right? When I think of Banjo-Kazooie, I think of kind of snarky, humorous dialogue or something like that. The characters have a similar thing here where they kind of squawk and crow as the text appears on screen, but in a robot voice instead of a bird voice, right? But it's more focused, I think, on more positive elements of kind of communications, right? So sympathy, kindness, and in some ways vulnerability, being open to showing a side of you to other people and that kind of thing. And I also think it has an innocent sense of humor as well. This is not always serious all the time. There's a cat who's screaming about needing food all the time, and I think it does a good job of comedic timing on that stuff. Overall, though, it is definitely one of those kind of feel-good games with a strong core message, right? Of kind of, how you help other characters, right? And I think helping encourage happiness in others is a big part in Chibi-Robo. But I think what's really different here, and I think why it kind of resonates with me a little bit more than Chibi-Robo does at times, is that a lot of this is focused around, I think, the idea that one act of kindness kind of can change somebody's day around or life around, depending on how you want to look at it, where, there's these very short and sweet narratives where you have these kind of extreme problems, maybe not extreme, but very upfront problems that they kind of put in front of the player that this character's having, and you get a very direct view of how that's impacting a character. And then once you kind of go through and finish the quest, that usually results in a very big change in their demeanor and things like that. So I think overall it does a really good job of having these really short and sweet, kind of punchy stories here that kind of help you resonate with a lot of these characters over time. And if you have some of the issues these characters have, some characters might connect with you more than others. The game is constantly moving. You're constantly moving from one new environment to another. So who these characters are changing, as you go through the game. So you don't spend too much time with any one character, but I think that's kind of the benefit of this game, is that you're kind of constantly moving on and performing these acts of kindness to new characters and seeing how it solves their problems in different ways and things like that. The main story itself, I will say, is you go through these worlds. It does take a little while to get going. There's kind of this straightforward story about we're going on an adventure because this event happens kind of thing. And I feel the first half of the game kind of gets stuck in that kind of narrative loop a little bit. But overall, once you get to the second part of the game, I think a lot of the characters really start to develop on their own. But they kind of go from having, I think, a more passive personality that's more reflective on characters to having their own personalities a little bit more, and having their own personal issues play a bigger role in like how they're interacting with characters towards the end. So I definitely think the payoff is there, and eventually those kind of stories align with like the rest of the characters throughout the game. Although one thing that doesn't really change that much throughout the game is the actual like character movement. This game doesn't really have like new abilities or anything like that you get throughout the game. You do get outfits. You get very cute outfits, which I appreciate. But your character has kind of a standardized move set, and a lot of the grounded techniques they have are a little straightforward. Like you have the ability to like attack things with like a paper clip or safety pin, and the combat just feels a little wonky. But overall, it feels more like a puzzle solving tool than it does a something that's really the core part of the game and something you're supposed to really engage with. I think where most the appeal of this game comes from a playability standpoint, is basically how Buddy, the main character Buddy, I don't know if I said that at this point, Buddy moves around the world, because when he jumps, he is incredibly floaty in the air, and you have lots of air control. And he also moves like pretty fast too. So he can double jump, he can do a dash. And because you have a lot of this aerial momentum, it means you can get around the world in a really fast way. Which I think when you're looking at the world from like the small little character perspective, I think the danger you kind of run into with some of these games is that the game can feel slow and it can feel really burdensome to get around the world. And I think Misc does a great job of like avoiding that entirely, because the character themselves is very fast and flexible. They're able to get up on ledges that feel like they're like just out of reach, but you can often get up on them. But the game feels designed with that in mind, so it doesn't feel like you're like abusing the game. You can pretty easily get over fences by doing some like clever platforming and things like that. So I think that's like a really fun part of the game. And I think that like really gives this sense of freedom and flexibility without like losing scope of like the size of the world. The world does still feel big, and you will still need to get up on things to get around, but it doesn't feel like it is a chore to get on things. I guess this is the point I'm trying to make. So, and maybe a part of that is also because a lot of this game takes place outdoors. Unlike most of the Chibi-Robo games, this game takes place in various, I guess it's like a garden, but like the environment changes, and they have like silly little lore reasons why. Like there's a desert, which I assume is like kind of like a sand pit kind of thing, or like a sand play place. And then there's like the snowy areas, like an AC got stuck on and it's like blowing out cold air, so it's making it snow, or silly little things like that. But I think visually the game does kind of blend together a little bit. It has this very like rustic look to it, you know, because you're outside, everything's a little bit worn down. And there's like a narrative reason for that, but at times it does kind of feel like the areas don't like pop as much as I'd like them to. I think what I would like is like to see a little bit more color, but I think when it comes to aesthetically, it has a very consistent look to it, and I think that's kind of part of its personality. And again, like I said, narratively, it kind of fits, I think, what's going on in that world. And I think ultimately it kind of gives the game its own aesthetic. So I think that also helps too with like differentiating it. And overall, even with that complaint, I do think that the game makes it up with a lot of very fun character designs. The characters are very animated. I'd say generally they're very charming. They're all built out of like random bits of outside junk and things like that. So they've got like a lot of fun personality to how they were designed, and they feel very intentional. And as you go through and collect all the trash, you also can like unlock developer documents and stuff to see like how all these characters were designed and the general feel they're trying to go with each world thematically and things like that. I also visually think it's just a really nice looking game too. I played the original Switch version, so I'm sure there's better ways to play this game on PC and Switch too and things like that. But I think generally, I don't see any way that this game really feels like it compromised on its vision at all on the Switch version. I think it runs perfectly fine for me, but I'm not much of a technical guy. I don't really care too much about that. So, but I'm sure other platforms would be like the place you'd want to go if you really want to like squeeze the most out of the game's textures or something like that. But overall, I think it's a really smart game. I think any time I see something like this where it seems like it's very much pulling from a very specific franchise, the fear I always have is like, is this just going to feel like, you know, like weird off-brand Chibi-Robo, right? But I think it does a really good job of knowing what to adopt from Chibi-Robo and kind of like bringing that into its own, right? I think it creates something substantial, taking kind of the core themes of what makes a Chibi-Robo game work and developing that in a way that feels, you know, unique to Misc, in my opinion at least. So And I think that really helps with like helping the game's narrative stand out as well. So as much as this little guy looks like Chibi-Robo, he is very much his own thing. And in a lot of ways, that's a great thing.